What makes a strong leader? Every manager has an individual style, whether it's to be a tough talker, a team leader who aims for emotional intelligence, or something in between. The MIT Sloan Management Review article, 5 Leadership Lessons for Tough CEOs, detailed what leaders who trade more in fear than empathy are missing. In this video, author Brian Elliott talks about where he's seeing a rise in command and control tactics. He also offers some alternative options that can make workplaces run more effectively. He says fear-mongering has its limits. Why are CEOs intent on scaring employees when it comes to artificial intelligence?
We've seen a raft of CEOs coming out with tough talk when it comes to AI and its potential impact on workers' jobs. And I've talked with a number of leaders and people inside of these companies, and I think there's a few different reasons why. Some of this is being caused by genuine concern, I believe. So if you listen to Jim Farley, Ford's CEO, earlier this summer, what he was talking about was the fact that they're seeing a shortage in manufacturing labor, in frontline labor that he's concerned about. But he also sees the impact of AI over time coming for up to half of office workers' jobs. But sometimes this is a signal to Wall Street. As a tough-talking CEO, I'm going to make sure that we optimize our workforce. And the loudest voices in all of that are, it turns out, the big tech companies. And that shouldn't surprise us, because those big tech CEOs are often also the ones who are out there selling the tools. And if they can't sell the tools, then they have a different challenge on their hands. And so far, the sales of the tools are not quite keeping up with the expenses that they're putting into it in the first place. And so if you listen to the big tech CEOs, you're hearing a lot of AI is going to displace jobs because they need that to happen in order to fund the investment. Fear, though, is not the world's greatest motivator. In fact, fear will actually cause people to hold back. Slack did a piece of research last fall which actually showed that 47% of people are unwilling to tell their manager that they're using generative AI because they fear being seen as incompetent or incapable. And if people are fearful for their jobs, they're much more likely to hide the fact that they're using AI. If instead they're incented to talk about the outcomes they're trying to drive and bigger goals, then they're more likely to share it. A great example of this is Lauren Franklin. Lauren runs customer support at Zapier. Zapier makes technology tools themselves, so they have a front row seat for what's happening. Customer service, as a lot of us have seen, is on the front line of AI deployments, right? Klarna famously last year or so said they were going to displace all of their customer service employees in favor of AI tools, and then reverse course about a year later when they realized it wasn't really serving their customers' needs. What Lauren did was different. Lauren sat down with her team and she said, hey, look, the tools are coming and the tools are going to be better and better over time. What I need all of us to do is to lean in and learn how to use these tools. And if we do it, as the company grows and scales, we'll keep employment flat, but you all will learn new skills along the way in order to be able to deal with the scale of the business. Her team rose to the occasion, but they rose to the occasion because Lauren was in the mix with them. She literally was in the work queue on Monday mornings, seeing what was working and what wasn't when it came to these new tools. At the end of the day, what she got was much higher adoption, and what her workers got was much higher skill sets, as well as higher compensation, which is really a fantastic outcome, and shows how empathetic, engaged leadership can make a real difference in AI adoption.
Do some types of leaders, like company founders, have to be tough to succeed?
So in the column, we compared Elon Musk and we compared him against Tim Cook and Satya Nadella, because Tim Cook and Satya Nadella have created massive amounts of valuation over the past few years, more so than their founder predecessors did. But a reader on LinkedIn pointed out that Elon Musk is a founder, that Satya Nadella and Tim Cook are not founders, that even though they created a lot of value, they weren't the ones that started the company. But if you look at Steve Jobs and if you look at Bill Gates, they weren't just founders, they were also pretty tough talking leaders themselves and kind of noted for it. And I've thought about this a lot, and I've got a couple of thoughts for you. One is they were absolutely tough talk leaders. They also moderated to some degree over time, especially Steve Jobs. If you talk to people who worked at Pixar or later stages of Apple, Steve did moderate to some degree. Now, what also happened is at some of these companies, things change over time. So Bill Gates was followed by Steve Ballmer. Ballmer was an even more tough talking leader. Ballmer's the one that put in place forced ranking performance scoring, the so-called rank and yank systems that create a lot more internal competition inside the company. Ballmer's also noted as being the CEO over what gets termed Microsoft's lost decade, when internal competition stifled their performance overall and they slipped sideways. Satya Nadella came back in after Ballmer, and what he did that was really notable was reinstituted a culture of cooperation. He would sit with his entire leadership team on Fridays for multiple hours at a time to have conversations about how do we all work together? How do we get alignment? How do we have big goals, but how do we work on them cooperatively as a team? That human-centered leadership has been seen as being completely responsible for Microsoft's dramatic turnaround in fortune that actually has made them the company they are today. There's also been tough-talking leaders who, like Travis Kalanick at Uber, were able to get a company to a certain stage, but were not going to make it successful. In fact, might have led to its failure. Where a CEO that stepped in, Dara Khosrowshahi, was actually the one that got the company to be the success it is today, who is a more human-centered leader that could actually bring people together and align them on a common vision.
There's been a notable return of the so-called rank and yank forced ranking systems. What's behind this drive?
There's been a resurgence of stacked ranking systems. So 5% of the company can be rated at the very top, and you get the middle ratings, and then you've got 5%, maybe 10%, maybe 15% that have to be rated at the very bottom. Most of this resurgence is happening in big tech companies. It's happening in large part because the AI investments these companies are making are not paying off as fast as they would like. And in order to hit quarterly earnings, they're cutting back expenses everywhere else, and that includes humans. Microsoft's president, Brad Smith, said this basically recently when he said, look, this isn't about people's performance. It's just the fact that we have more people than we can afford right now, given the investments that we're making. And so they've cut back in a number of different places. This is the most stark at Meta. Meta went from a ranking system that said 5% have to be at the bottom to this year saying that 15 to 20% of people have to be at the bottom end of the spectrum. Now, think about that. You're a manager who's hired people onto your team over the past couple of years. You've probably already weeded out the bottom of the team. All of a sudden, you got to find 15 to 20% that are now the bottom of the team. That's going to be a real challenge, and it's going to be a real challenge that we have seen play out in other companies in the past. GE was famous for this in the 1990s. Jack Welch actually promoted it and pushed it a lot, but it remains the fact that rank and yank systems at GE created more internal competition than they did external competition. Steve Ballmer followed suit at Microsoft in the 2000s, and what the studies have shown subsequently is that internal competition just slows things down. It means that you actually have less cooperation internally because you're spending more time competing with each other to make sure that your team gets rated lower than mine, or I get rated higher than you. That's not a healthy environment to be in. It also causes top talent to leave. Why would that be when you're just pushing out the bottom of the ranks? Well, there's a limit at the top too, remember. So if I've got 10 people on a team, then I can only rate 2 at the top. And if there are 4 people of equal talent, capability, and impact, that means 2 of them made it and 2 of them didn't, and that probably impacts their compensation. And so the 2 who didn't make it are probably going to look elsewhere for employment. How you treat people through performance ranking systems sets a real tone from a culture perspective. And they might have good short-term impacts for some big tech companies of getting rid of some workers to hit this quarter's earnings. But long-term, the impacts have been negative, and it's been shown multiple times in the past.
Why are CEOs continuing to turn up the RTO commands?
I've written a lot about the return to office battles over the past few years, and where we are right now is a lot of tough talk leaders who are saying that they need people back in the office for collaboration and camaraderie and connection and all the C words that they love to trot out without a lot of data behind it. And it's still largely a CEO-driven set of conversations. What's different now is that it's not landing with their teams, and it's not actually happening from a compliance perspective. First thing is, those tough-talking CEOs, when they say it, are often putting their managers in a bind in the first place. So if you're a manager and you've got a lot of pressure to deliver, to do more with less, et cetera, in 2025, and you've got a team of people who are coming in 2 or 3 days a week to be with their team because it makes sense and because you got purpose-driven ways of working, and your CEO declares that 4 or 5 is the right answer, you're not probably going to fire those people if they're good performers if they're still coming in 2 or 3 days a week. It's just not going to happen because you need them too much to deliver on your company's goals. 3M went from work your way as being the way that people are expected to work to a CEO who now says 4 days a week in the office is the right answer. By the way, that CEO is new, came in last year and decided that he didn't like the way things were working and decided to change it. So it's very often a CEO-driven decision in these conversations. What we're seeing, though, more broadly is 5 days a week is actually pretty unusual. So the Flex Index data that my company actually produces came out in Q2 with our latest Flex report that tracks 8,500 companies in the US. And 67% of US companies still have some form of flexibility, anywhere from complete employee choice and fully remote to 4 days a week in the office. The most popular programs are structured hybrid. About 43% of US companies have something that has some form of structure underneath it. The most popular within that is 3 days a week. And 3 days a week, RTO, return to office demands, have gone up. They've gone up about 13% over the course of the past year. What hasn't gone up is people coming back into the office. If you look at actual office utilization, if you track it through Nick Bloom and Stanford's data, if you look at the US Census Bureau data, if you look at office utilization metrics coming out of the commercial real estate industry, what you'll see is a rise that's anywhere from 0 to 3%. So 13% higher commands, 0 to 3% increase, means that people aren't necessarily complying with this. All you're doing in these ongoing conversations is creating more tension inside your company internally. There's 3 questions I love to ask CEOs in these conversations when we're talking about this. Number 1, what problem are we trying to solve? Because more often than not, there's multiple root causes that have to do with why you're seeing a challenge inside of a company. Number 2, what's your talent strategy? Are you after highly talented, engaged employees and talent you can get from anywhere? By the way, NVIDIA is a company that's highly dependent on being able to access more and more talent from more and more places, and they're a highly flexible company. Within that talent strategy, though, is an important 3rd question, which is, are your teams distributed or co-located? If I've got teams of salespeople that are junior sales folks and they are co-located in cities, asking them to be in the office 3 days a week is not much of a hardship because they'll get time on Tuesdays for lunch and learns. They'll get pitch practice sessions on Wednesdays, and maybe we do pipeline reviews on Thursdays. Those are activities that they all are encouraged to participate in that have purpose behind them and that bring people together. On the other hand, if I've got product development teams, engineers, product managers, designers, that are in fluid teams that are continuously recomposed every 6 months or so, and they live in multiple cities, asking them to march into the office 3, 4, 5 days a week to be with their team just doesn't work. And so thinking about the talent strategy that you've got behind it is going to take you much further than a simple command. And the last point is, look, you hire really expensive, really great leaders around the executive table. Should the CEO be making that decision, or should that decision lie in the hands of that head of sales and that head of engineering to figure out what's best for their team? There are much better solutions out there than the tough talk CEO who wants to march everybody back into the office.
Strong leaders build trust by being empathetic and dependable.
Tough talking leaders often fail to appreciate that reliability, dependability is the foundation of trust. Whether or not I can trust my leaders to do what they say, and whether or not leaders feel like they can trust their teams to do what they've committed to do, is really the foundation not just of building and generating trust, but actually of results, right? And we can see this in the data. Institute for Corporate Productivity did a study last year where they actually took companies and they measured their performance against their industry on things like sales growth, profitability, customer satisfaction. And the difference between the top performers and the bottom performers was trust. When leaders were more trusting of their teams, they're 11 times more likely to be at the top of that list. Now, I've had a lot of leaders say to me, but I can't just trust people. How do I actually make that happen? Well, human-centered leadership is not just about giving people trust. It's actually about being demanding and being clear about goals, about outcomes. Clarity of outcomes and goals helps people get aligned. It also creates systems where you reward people on the basis of outcomes. If you're rewarding them on the basis of outcomes in that activity, then people feel like it's a fair field. I actually talked about this in a recent column that I wrote for Sloan Management Review, talking about Neiman Marcus Group and the work that Eric Severson and team did there, shifting to a quarterly measurement that managers did with their employees of their performance. And what happened? They actually increased their retention rates among people that they wanted to keep by 50%, because this includes store workers. They also increased their wanted attrition, meaning performance-driven attrition, by 3x. The same thing is true when it comes to AI. BCG had a case study recently where they showed that managers getting in with their teams and talking about the goals they've got and engaging their team on how are we going to use these tools to get better to achieve those goals gave people something that didn't feel like you're just going to push me out of the organization. The other thing those leaders did by being in there with their teams is signal that they were going to roll up the sleeves and learn this themselves. That drove 89% higher AI adoption rates inside those organizations than people that simply had a leader who sent out the memo. So at the end of the day, human-centered leadership is about being demanding, but being supportive of people. Tough talk isn't going to get you there. You've got to be demanding and you've got to support your teams in order to accomplish the great goals that you're setting out for them.
The evidence is clear. Fear might get compliance, but trust gets results. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, check out Brian's full article and his Work Forward newsletter. Links below. Are you seeing tough talk in your workplace? We'd love to hear your story in the comments. Thanks for watching.